Good day, everyone. It's CJ. It is Wednesday, July the 13th, and want to welcome you to another live stream of the Gadfly. Again, if you have not done so yet, the link is in the description. Jump over to the gadfly.vhx.tv. There you'll learn about our subscription-based multi-channel content there. Also want to ask you to follow us on Twitter, which is at the Gadfly MCN. And today I'm with Paul of the Sears Report, and also show Paul a little love and visit his work over at thesearsreport.com. And don't forget about his premium content, which are his daily podcasts as well. So, Paul, great day. How are you, sir?
Yes, very well. How are you?
I'm doing great, Paul. Overall, want to apologize a little bit for my voice. It seems like the allergy season is continuing through the summer. We had a little bit of rain, which made it a little bit worse, but I think it's tolerable.
So yeah, we talking about really, it's a good point to constantly reflect upon the fact we have what's left of the unipolar world, which is dying rapidly, and the ongoing, I wouldn't even call it birth, just the ongoing development of the multipolar world, and how these two worlds are coexisting. And it's interesting that Putin basically made the point the other day that, effectively to that intent, that this is where we are. This is how the world is now. And, the West or US hegemony, the US dollar, that kind of exceptionalism is dead. It's over. Just a question of the United States understanding that. And its allies actually coming to the realization that that's the case as well. Because at the moment, Europe's kind of playing along with it, but not entirely. And we can discuss the reasons why. And then you have, say, Japan, which is to some extent Australia, which seems to be more so than any of the aforementioned nations. But then you have the United Kingdom, which in some ways is being more aggressive, say, about the Ukraine war than the United States is, in basically prosecuting the war and the desire to keep the war going. And on the flip side to this, you then have the ongoing developments of the multipolar world and how there's this rapid acceleration caused, of course, as we said before, by the Ukraine war itself, which really was the accelerant for many things that were going to happen, have happened. And really an understanding in the global south that this war happened for reasons no one in the West very few in the West are prepared to understand why, or even accept the reasons why Russia did it. That's an important distinction. Because it's, from the West perspective, it's being sold as Russian aggression. Russian aggression because Russia wants to expand its empire. Putin's got ideas of being Peter the Great, and he wants to expand Russia and make the old Soviet Union. So first it's Ukraine, and then it's the Baltic states and Poland. I mean, even though, of course, this is utterly nonsensical, because invading a NATO member state is World War III. And cool heads in the United States, in the military, and even the intelligence agencies never want World War III. You might get these lunatic politicians who'd like to see World War III, but they aren't the decision makers, fortunately. And this is just not reality. This is why this war came about. The war came about for a number of principal reasons. And whether people like it in the West or don't like it, it's worth reiterating those as a starting point, which is it was absolutely clear that there was a mass build upon what was the old contact line before the present war started, where Ukraine forces mixed in with the neo-Nazis were intent on destroying east of the contact line in Donbass, and quite literally just killing all ethnic Russians. That was absolutely clear. The other thing that's now become clear, and maybe Russia was aware of this, but didn't say anything, which I suspect was the case. But if you look at in the south and east of Ukraine, every single town and city and even villages have been fortified, indicating clearly they were expecting a war, and not expecting a war because Russia was going to invade. This was things that have been developed since 2014 when the Maidan happened and the whole sort of present conflict in Donbass came into existence. So that was one fundamental reason. Other reasons obviously include the fact that of what was actually going on in South and East Ukraine with regards to the treatment of Russians, not just banning the Russian language, but actually clearly genocidal behavior, whether people like that word used or not, it was, because it was intent on trying to kill Russians. The other issue that came about was when Zelensky kind of let slip about the issue of nuclear weapons or Ukraine having nuclear weapons or perhaps the capability to have them. Of course, that is totally unacceptable and a red line for Russia. And then there's the long-standing issue of these biolabs, and people think that story's died. It hasn't even barely scratched the surface. That was another indication that from Russia's perspective, they had to go in and do something about this because that posed a threat to them. It posed a threat to in the wider context of Europe. And we recall before the war started, there was all these statements about chemical weapons provocations that might have been unleashed by Russia. And then, of course, during the early stage of the war and subsequently occasionally, but nowhere near like it was, that Russia would do this. Well, tie that in with these biolabs and maybe something will be pinned on Russia, which could, in principle, be a catalyst to start World War III properly, not the kind of World War III we're going through now, which is far more economic, financial, and geopolitical. It's not militarily the case, but these were fundamental reasons. Now, people in the West won't accept this. They don't believe it. But they need to understand that's the reality. That's the rationale. Now, understanding it and agreeing with it are two different things. And I can perfectly understand why people would say, well, I still don't agree with it. But people need to accept in the West, this is the reality. This is why it's happened. Got nothing to do with Russia wanting to extend its borders. It just so happens, of course, and this is a coincidence, that those, Donetsk, Lugansk, and Kherson and Zaporizhia are all predominantly have ethnic Russians living there, who are very much opposed to what's going on in Ukraine, would like autonomy, would like to be independent republics, and ultimately probably want to be part of Russia. But Putin came out with an interesting statement the other day where they've basically written this decree a few months back, which fast tracks people in Ukraine, which are predominantly Russians, of course, who wanted to get a Russian passport, to become a Russian citizen. And he came out with a statement going, we're extending that to all Ukrainians. That is hugely significant for a number of reasons. One, the implication's always been, even though the West won't accept this, that Russia doesn't want to kill Ukrainians. It doesn't even want to kill the regular Ukrainian military and all the conscripts that are now being dragged out their homes and conscripted. And they're even being rounded up on beaches and everywhere else. And in the most peculiar locations. They've got no problem with that. Their problem from their perspective, and again, you always have to look at the reality of what they think, relates to the obvious issue of the neo-Nazis and what they've been doing. Their issue is with them and also the administration and those who are allowing this to happen. That's been absolutely clear from day one. Whether people, again, want to accept this or not is really not the point. But that's kind of fundamentally the whole basis of the problem. So by him saying this with passports, and they've made this point, we don't have a problem. Really, there's a kind of almost fraternity between Ukraine and Russia, but it's kind of almost getting to the point now where you look at Ukraine and say, well, who knows when this so-called special military operation finishes. And of course, Ukraine's getting given more and more weapons, heavier weapons, with the ranges up to 300 miles. Now, that may risk that Russia will say, we're not calling it a special military operation anymore. We're declaring war. And if you declare war, all bets are off. What then happens? That could have catastrophic consequences for innocent Ukrainians. It also for the Ukrainian military, because then everything's a legitimate target. And the idea of trying to preserve life ceases to be the issue, because at the moment, whether people want to agree with it or this assessment or not, the Ukrainians are just bombing residential areas in Donetsk, killing innocent civilians. It's a war crime. And the more potent their weapons are and they can launch them from a greater distance, the bigger the risk is. And that might tip things, unfortunately, into a direction in the war no one should want to see. No matter whether you're extremely pro-Russian or you're pro-Ukrainian, it's just because it's a very, very, sadly, would be a hugely devastating development. The other question is unless there's some political settlement that's going to happen, not necessarily today or tomorrow, but eventually, even if east of the Dnieper was all independent republics, I'm not saying it will be, but just we're using this as an example, or huge swathes of it wanted to be part of Russia and, you know, had referendums and became part of Russia, the issue is you're still going to have a rump state of Ukraine. And the problems the rump state of Ukraine presents is not going to be any different. It's just moved a few hundred miles west. So there might be an argument that says Russia in the end will go, we have to take the whole country one way or the other. And then there's still the question, when that's over, what happens? And it's not a matter then of Russia wanting to control a whole nation, then take another nation after that. It's quite simply because, from their perspective, has the problem gone away? And maybe to some extent it has, but maybe to a large extent it hasn't. And unless that problem's gone away, then whether this turns into a war from Russia's perspective or not, the principle still applies. And therefore, they would carry on a special military operation, or what if it then becomes a war, until the threat that whatever's left of Ukraine goes away, in the sense that it's never going to join NATO. It's not going to have any desire for nuclear weapons. It's not, these biolabs will all be shut down. There won't be any Western meddling in these nations. It will become a completely neutral state. And the question is that feasible? Is that possible? Well, yes, anything's possible. But as things stand, it's not. So the risk is the war carries on until Russia effectively controls the entire nation. And then the question is, what do they do with it? Does it end up all becoming part of Russia? And then people say, see, we told you this was going to happen. And these are difficult questions. But most certainly the escalation from the West it could inevitably turn this into a proper war. And then people will understand why it was called a special military operation, because Russia was trying to avoid civilian casualties, at even killing regular Ukrainian military and not destroying infrastructure. That will all change, and that will have devastating consequences for principally a lot for Ukrainian people, because it begs the question, how are they going to handle Western Ukraine on that basis? I mean, are they just going to start launching massive missile strikes and just destroying entire cities in the West? I'm not saying they will do. We don't know. But there's a risk of that if it becomes a full-blown war. And Putin made the statement, which the West, of course, will have ignored or laughed off as not reality, when he basically said, we've not really done anything so far, meaning we haven't even used any of our firepower or our ability if we wanted to wage a proper war. But the risk is you tip that balance and it becomes a proper war. And then, sadly, the Ukrainian people are the ones who will suffer. But then the West will understand what a war really is from a Russian perspective. And compared to what they've done now, which is bad enough in the context, of the loss of some civilian lives, but also the needless loss of Ukrainian military personnel lives and conscripts who've been quite literally told, well, you have a week's training and then you're stuck on the front line. I mean, I don't know about anyone else, but if I was given a week's training and stuck on the front line, I'd be dead in half an hour. I wouldn't have a clue. I don't know anything about fighting a war or being in the military or anything. I would just be a sitting duck. And that's what a lot of these people are being exposed to. And there's forget all the rumors and counter rumors. Oh, we're going to raise another million large army and we're going to defeat Russia. What, a million bunch of conscripts who don't know anything about war against a professional army? Well, sadly, the outcome's going to be devastating for those people. So we have to hope this doesn't happen. But there comes a point when the question has to be asked, because Europe wants the war over from an economic standpoint, but politically they can't just say we want the war over, because that's not how politics works in the West. Again, we're back to this point that you would have the end of governments would collapse if they suddenly U-turn and went, right, we're removing sanctions, we want the war over, because people will say, well, why did you do it in the first place? You caused us all this economic financial ruin. But societally, Europe, for example, is starting to face problems. We've seen, okay, not related to the war, but all the protests in the Netherlands about their agricultural policy. We've seen it's happening in Germany. There's protests in Italy. And it doesn't take much, whereas I keep coming back to this point, why nothing's done deliberately, is as soon as you start to affect the livelihoods of regular citizens, and that can be because of agricultural policy, but it can be food and energy considerations and what we're going to end up with in the winter, given what looks likely to happen, then you're going to start to have to face serious risks of societal unrest at home and in their nations. And there comes a point where it's all well and good not to lose political face because of a war in Ukraine and the policies we adopt with respect to Russia. But the other flip side to this, when it's suddenly a political situation where people in countries are cold, hungry, and because of economic financial collapse, risk losing everything, then the dynamic shifts. We have to deal with that, and they are very nervous about that. So the chances are there might be a point when Europe says enough's enough and which will capitulate and say, well, the political fallout is worse if we continue supporting this war in the context of providing military hardware and sanctions, but in reality not really wanting to be part of this. And therefore, maybe Europe will break ranks and things will change. But predominantly the biggest drivers are wanting to carry this on, and it's not every facet, is the United Kingdom and the United States. They're the two who really want this war to carry on because they think at some point Russia will crack. And of course, they're being fed a load of lies themselves, because all these military experts who would have undoubtedly encouraged the West to start to keep this war going, because you'll defeat Russia, you'll defeat them militarily. In Ukraine, you'll defeat them economically, financially, we'll remove Putin. It's not happening. So they're not going to equally stand there and go, well, we made a mistake, we should never have done this. So they'll just keep convincing governments that, if we carry on, eventually we'll succeed. And then there's all the propaganda, lying about Russian casualties, Ukrainian casualties, the reality of what's happening in these countries. And we have seen some mainstream media going into the south and east Ukraine from areas that are no longer effectively at war, thinking, well, we're going to interview a bunch of people and they're all going to moan about the Russians. They're all going, we're really pleased Russia's liberated us. And there was even Ukrainians interviewed who were pleased that Russia had done what they'd done because it removed the insidious elements that were controlling that part of Ukraine, i.e. the neo-Nazis, the far right, etc. And it just, from a standpoint of the media, it was completely blew up in their face, because then they're like, well, this isn't what we were expecting to be told. And we've seen the mainstream media slowly walking back into not kind of admitting that Russia's winning the war, but they're trying to phrase things differently, because you can't go from telling us for months that Russia's losing and then, suddenly, Russia's won, because it just doesn't, it's not going to wash with people. But that's the sort of battleground that's existing in Ukraine between multipolarity and unipolarity. And we still have the issue with Taiwan. And again, the United States is trying to egg the UK on in towards kind of challenging the fact that they're trying to convince everyone that China's always going to invade Taiwan, which it's not. It's not shown any indication. And then, but it's a similar thing with regards to Russia and Ukraine. But there might come a point when a red line's crossed with Taiwan, and then China might invade, or there might be a war. And then the West will go, see, we told you it was going to happen. Not, well, look at all our provocation, look at all our aggression that we cause. So it's the same operation or MO as Russia and Ukraine. But again, the United Kingdom is being egged on by the United States to get involved and try and support this effort. And there's a belief that if there then was a military conflict between the Chinese and Taiwan, which is not going to be Russia and Ukraine, and then the usual suspects are, well, Japan and South Korea would need to support this war effort, whatever it means, against China. I mean, and those nations must be looking at this going, hang on, we don't want any part of this. You know, this is our near neighbor. You know, we're not support. We don't have treaties. We're not part of NATO or any organization that means, you know, if there was a military strike, for argument's sake, by China on Japan, and does Japan even have the capability to defend itself? No, it doesn't. Then what's the implications? But this is the mindset. So they're the kind of conflicts that the West is generating to try and derail what it perceives to be the two main players who are kind of create or have created this multipolar world and all these developments. They're the ones driving it. So we need to do everything to try and destroy and derail those two nations, because we have to end multipolarity without actually realizing unipolarity is dead anyway. And this empire is dead. It's dying. It's not going to be resurrected. The world's moving on. It's not a question that they're going to survive this. It's not like a 2008 where we'll just reinflate the banks and we'll deal with all this illusionary financial world, and that will resolve the problem. We're talking about the real world, where, you know, the saying goes, you can't print oil and you can't print wheat, you can't print gas, and, you know, you can't print food. You know, we're dealing with reality now, and you can't change reality and using illusionary financialization of economies, which we've had since the Reagan era. I mean, effectively, it was Reaganomics that wrecked the United States. And the UK, of course, had it with Thatcher. It's the same principle. It shouldn't. That was really a major, huge mistake when they turned economies into an illusion, backed by illusion, instead of having economies that ran by reality, going, well, what does a real economy need? It needs to be manufacturing. It needs production. It needs wealth generation or wealth creation. It needs food security. It needs energy security, and managing your economy that way. And of course, they turn their back on it, and that's the part they don't seem to understand, that they've destroyed reality, or they're in the process of destroying reality, and all the illusion they've had in place for 40 years is not going to save that illusion, and they still haven't grasped that, which is why we see harebrained situations where Germany's a great example of this, where its economy is cratering. It's got a really bad inflation. It's got energy problems, as we know. And yet it steadfastly comes out and goes, well, we're still ending importing Russian coal on the 1st of August, and we're going to end Russian oil imports at the end of December. They've learned nothing, because they've lived in this illusionary world, which is always, well, you can just print money and that solves the problem. You know, either you're money print, or you're just, you know, you just live in this credit debt market, which means we're constantly refinancing, or we're constantly loaning more money to pay for tomorrow, and not realizing you can't do this. This doesn't resolve the problems we're facing. So, you know, you need to accept you can't wean yourself off Russian energy. This is the real world. And by doing the policies you're doing, you're just destroying your nation. You're destroying reality. And They still haven't grasped this, and maybe some people will say it's an extreme statement, and it depends how people perceive this. But Lavrov made the statement that the West or Western politicians or Western governments or Western nations are being run by schizophrenics, meaning they have no grasp of reality. They don't live in the real world. They don't understand that if you have oil and gas shortages, there isn't an oil and gas supermarket where you can just go and buy 1 million barrels of oil because they just happen to be lying on a shelf. Or you can buy 1 billion cubic feet of gas because someone just happens to be producing it but not selling it. Or, there's all this food just lying around somewhere waiting for someone to buy it. This isn't a supermarket. This isn't, oh, I need to go and buy some weekly food shopping, groceries, and I just go to the supermarket and buy what I need because it's always there. That's the kind of illusion they live in. They don't understand the reality that the world doesn't function that way. And that's because we've lived for decades in this illusionary world of financialization, which made them go, well, there's always an answer. The answer always will be provided, not realizing that financialization was going to cause effectively not just 2008, but when the dot-com bubble burst as well. And they pumped all this money into something that was never going to make any profit. That was done because there wasn't an indirect admission that financialization wasn't working. Oh, we need another revolution. So they then have a green revolution and everyone thinks it's nefarious. And, oh, they're deliberately destroying it. No, they're not deliberately. They actually, these people who are in the ear of politicians morning, noon, and night going, if we don't do this, the world's going to eviscerate. We're going to have sea levels will rise 30 feet and all these kind of things will happen. And they get told this. And they get to the point where if you tell someone the same thing so many times, they believe it and they know if they come out and disagree with it, they're finished politically. But it's not a thing they're deliberately trying to destroy everything, because if they were deliberately trying to destroy everything, you wouldn't have Europe going, well, we've decided now to make gas and nuclear green energy. They just say, no, we're not doing that. We want solely green energy. And it isn't deliberate. They actually genuinely believe this. And they think if they don't do this, the world will be destroyed. Even though the policy decisions of the Green Revolution are totally flawed and fail. And in reality, they are destroying the energy security of the likes of Europe and the West. And people think, oh, it must be deliberate. No, it's just absolute stupidity. It is kind of schizophrenic behavior, for want of a better word, in just no grip on reality. And, it's the same policy. Look at what happened in the pandemic. It's exactly the same. Absolute stupid policy decisions where they were going, okay, give them cut them a bit of slack for a month or two at the start of the pandemic. But all these policy decisions would be made because they genuinely thought that, we'd all die from the pandemic. And everyone goes, no, it's nefarious. They're doing it all deliberately. They're locking us all down, and it's all a deliberate policy. Remember when it started? The usual suspects were going, once they've locked us down, we'll all be locked down forever. That never happened. Here we are. In the United Kingdom, for 12 months, we've had no policies in place, none whatsoever. You do anything you want, how you want, when you want. And that's been going on for 12 months. Well, that doesn't stack up with this idea that it's been done deliberately. Because if it was done deliberately, they would never have unlocked things. Things wouldn't be the way they are. If you follow the logical course through what they're doing, as totally flawed as it is, and totally failing, yes, there are people making huge amounts of money. No one's disputing that. But that doesn't make it nefarious as why it happened. That's just opportunism. When people jumped on the bandwagon and went, oh, we can make loads of money from Big Pharma, etc. But if you follow the logic through, this is just a policy decision that's been made because there was enough people convincing governments that if we don't do this, we're all going to die and the hospitals will collapse. And that's why they made the decision. And then when it was suddenly decided, well, actually, it's not that serious a problem, then they just stopped all these measures, and it's like it never happened. And okay, there's all whole issue, case numbers rising, and now the panic's starting to perhaps set in again that this is a problem. This is on the basis of ignorance, stupidity, and just very bad decision making. That's ultimately what leads to these policy decisions. And there's no difference between the Green Revolution and what is driving that fear, endless fear, baseless fear that this is going to be the consequence if we don't do this, and the consequence of the pandemic. It's the same thing. And this is why when reality starts to become something that even they can grasp, they start changing policy decisions, go, well, actually, this will have to be part of the Green Revolution. Gas and nuclear, even though we were going to shut all nuclear power plants and we're not going to use gas anymore. Now we are, because we understand we have to do that. It's not feasible to just have this idea we're going to manage our energy supplies on renewables. But it's not some intention to try and destroy the West, because we come to the point, when in history has an empire ever survived when its people were destitute, when they were starving, and when they had no heating, no lighting, effectively freezing? It never works. You're not. If anyone tells me that if that happened in the United States, that 300 million Americans are going to sit there and go, "We're happy with this," it's just that this is not reality. This isn't how reality plays out. This is what we're ending up with, and people go, "Well, it must be deliberate because they wouldn't allow this to happen." Well, they will, because they're that dumb and stupid. Because they live in bubbles, because they don't live in reality, because they think that everything's resolved by the fact that we have this ability to just go, well, we don't need this person's energy. We just find this energy elsewhere. We don't need this. We can just cut ourselves off from the Russians and it won't have any consequences. That's just extremely stupid policy making decision without understanding the consequences. And this is why you have in nations like Germany, politically, the same kind of stupidity, even though some of them are admitting we're in big trouble if we switch off the energy. They're worried Russia won't switch Nord Stream 1 back on after routine maintenance. And they know what the consequences will be. And that's why they're going to the German people, you need to shower less. We need to have, we need to, lessen our energy, the amount of energy we're consuming. Instead of going, switch Nord Stream 2 on, get Nord Stream 1 back on, and there's a huge part of our energy problem gone. They won't do it because for political reasons they can't. So they then just make more and more harebrained decisions. And people just for some bizarre reason go, well, this is deliberate. It's not, because let's hope it doesn't happen. But if Europe, the United States, and ends up with massive energy and food insecurity and inflation that's out of control, and the financial system collapses, and everyone's workforce gone. If that happens, then people are going to understand why this was never deliberate. Because look at what's happened in the Netherlands as one example. They obviously made a policy decision which was to try and effectively curtail quite a lot of its agricultural industry, which is, the Netherlands is the second biggest agricultural producer in the world, and it's phenomenal, its agricultural industry. And of course, harebrained, we need to reduce nitrogen emissions, so we're going to slash some of the farming. And what's happened? Farmers came out, had protests. They're now being joined by other elements in the Netherlands. There's a lot of public support. And this is just one example. This is an example of how people are mobilizing on the basis of something that will be a problem in the future, which it will be. You imagine when that problem isn't in the future and isn't happening in the present. What do we think the Dutch people are going to do if they're all of a sudden going, we're freezing cold in the winter, we've got massive food shortages, our banks are collapsing, and hang on, all that savings, all the investment, everything I've worked for is gone? Do we really think that the people are going to sit there and say nothing if they're already out protesting and mobilizing on the basis of something that is likely to be a problem in the future? That people are getting a taste of what will happen in the future. And what's absolutely clear is the European Commission has come out and gone, we're really frightened about this. We're worried about what will happen in terms of how societies will react if we have an energy crisis this winter and autumn. So we need to get away from believing that they want to destroy everything, whoever they are, because it's just not reality. Because they know the consequences of what will happen if indeed it comes to that. And we have to hope it doesn't, because that will create a societal meltdown that will be extremely destabilizing, never mind what it will do to people in terms of their own food and energy security, and then there's the psychological element and all the problems that societal breakdown happens. So unfortunately, this is just the political reality of, whereas if we were operating in the United Kingdom and I was the Prime Minister, I'd be going, we're not doing this. This is madness. I don't care whether it looks like we're U-turning. We are not sanctioning Russia on the basis of energy. Yeah, we don't want this war and we don't agree with them, but we're going to behave like adults and resolve this, because ultimately this is suicidal. It's suicidal economically, financially, society, and we're not going to do this. But that's what rational people would do in politics. We don't have rational people in politics. We have politicians who are just careerists, and they'll say and do everything to preserve their career. They'll make noises about being tough on Russia because they think it makes them look popular in political circles. They have ideas about being prime ministers and presidents based on delusion. They have this kind of idea that, well, I'm the right person. If you elect me, I'm going to make sure that Russia loses the war in Ukraine. I mean, and they believe this. They believe their own stupidity. They believe that if they say things, this is a reality, and they don't have any basis in reality. And this is a fundamental problem. Whereas when you look at nations in the global south, or you look at the Chinese and the Russians, they live in reality. They understand the ramifications of what's going on and the threat it poses, and why Russia is having to, and has been since 2014, diversifying its economy and de-dollarizing and looking to get out this financial system, knowing it's ultimately going to collapse. And China has had to make changes to do with its agricultural policy, its energy policy, and being mindful of the fact that the West is imploding. But really good friend of mine, and Lisa's, and people will know him from social media. He's done interviews. Simon Mikhailovich, who was obviously grew up young in Russia, and then he emigrated with his parents when he was 18 to the United States, and he understood the Soviet Union really well. And he makes the point, and I was only talking to him yesterday about not that, but just general conversation. And he makes the point how people in the Soviet era, the Politburo was coming out with all this garbage. Everyone was cheering them, going, yeah, the future's the Soviet Union, and anyone who'd engage their brain in these countries would go, oh, this isn't reality. And that's exactly where we are in the West. They're all cheering the Politburo and going, yes, we're going to win the war. We're going to stick it to Russia. We don't have a problem with our economy or our financial system. It's just a blip. Oh no, it's everything's in hand, nothing to worry about. And yet, anyone who's engaged in their brain knows this is absolute nonsense. And that's the reality, is the illusionary unipolar world that's rapidly failing for all the reasons we've discussed. And you continue to see them doubling down and believing it's reality. They're just the Soviet Politburo in denial, or just simply not accepting the reality. And then you have the rest of the world looking at this going, this is nuts, and we have to change, and we have to change rapidly. because we don't want to get sucked into this collapsing Western world, but more importantly, the collapsing Western financial system and our dependency or interdependency on that financial system, because we've got our own problems. If we get sucked into that as well, then that could cause us enormous problems or significant problems, and therefore we need to mitigate how we cease to be part of that. And it's like I say, with nations like Sri Lanka, which has collapsed completely and is bankrupt, it's very simple. Sri Lanka should tell the IMF and the World Bank to go away. Say we're defaulting on the money. No one's getting a dollar back, or a euro back, or a yuan back, or anything else. No one's getting anything. And it needs to turn around to the Russians and the Chinese and go, right, we want you to assist us. We want to rebuild on the basis that we can rebuild our economy, and not on the basis of the West that just never allows bankrupt nations to rebuild. In fact, they just keep crippling them more and more. And then the country gets assets stripped by Western entities. That has to end. Just walk away from it all, realize it's over, embrace the multipolar world, have nothing to do with the dollar, just completely distance yourself, and work with those nations that have real assets, meaning food or hard and soft commodities, energy, or markets, vertical markets, where you can actually have a proper functioning economy that manufactures and produces things.
Yeah, well said, Paul. I mean, it's the illusion of the West is quickly being destroyed. We see many signs of that, and you're exactly right. I think the situation unfolding in Ukraine has only quickened, strengthened the point of that, and I think it's also worth noting now that the U.S. is having to backtrack, if you will, a little bit in terms of some of the previous relationships and some of the comments they've made, and I'm alluding to Biden now having to go to the Saudis, and then also with Mexico, who recently did not attend one of the North American summits of the economy. So it's very interesting dynamics, Paul, to watch this unfolding this quickly.
Yeah, it is. But the other problem is the United States is incapable of negotiation. It's incapable of agreeing to disagree. It's incapable of having a resolution of win-win cooperation, of understanding that sometimes it just can't do what it wants to do, when it wants to do it, and how it wants to do it. So in the one breath, it might go to the Saudis, and because it's been begging them to increase oil production. But in the next breath, it'll then threaten Saudi if Saudi doesn't do what it wants them to do. And this is what the US does. It is incapable of having a civilized adult conversation with anyone. Even its allies are just vassal states. They're not really allies. They're just browbeaten into, well, it's our way or the highway. You were doing it this way. I mean, it's like the G7. The G7's a farce because the United States tells everyone what they're going to agree on the day, and we're going to pretend to have these conversations, and then you're all going to sign a communique that we've already agreed before we even started the G7 meeting. And that's the reality. You're not there to make decisions. You're not there to disagree. You're there just to do what we say, and often not what we do. And the problem is when's the United States going to change? When is there going to be a political leadership or some kind of political entity that actually sits in the US and goes, we can't do this anymore? And at the moment in the political structure, I don't see a single person who's actually going to go, no, we can't do this anymore. We actually have to sit there and actually sit down with the Chinese, the Russians, and everyone else to go, okay, it's over. The dollar's dead. Unipolarity is dead. Our empire's gone. What are we going to do about it? What can we do where we can work together? And how do we build trust? So nations will realize that if we sign an agreement, we're going to stick to that agreement. We're not going to sign an agreement and then ignore it when it doesn't suit us to. And that is the kind of mindset that the United States has to change. And the idea that it's always about competition. It's always about winning. whatever that means, even though it's winning from the United States perspective is not winning, it's losing. But again, it's all about perception of winning. When is that going to change? And at the moment, it's not going to change. There's no one there who's capable of doing it. And until then, nothing will change. And therefore, voting for one side or the other is not going to change anything. And okay, maybe Trump will stand in 2024. It's possible. But as things stand, is Trump being president going to change anything? Absolutely not, because he didn't do anything in 2020 or 2016 to 2020. It changed nothing. So why do we presuppose it will change anything? It won't. So, and it's the same in the West. I mean, there's an irony where with the Ukraine war, there's a kind of belief that the United States has scored some tactical victories because it's actually managed to galvanize Europe against Russia, which is what it's always wanted to do. But it has and it hasn't, and it's short-lived. And maybe Europe by this winter will go, sorry, you don't have our support anymore, because it's destroying us and we have to look after our own interests. So therefore, on that basis, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. We're not going to put up with this sanctioned regime and supporting this war the way we have, because it's completely destroying our own nations. But as things stand, that's the relationship the United States has with its so-called allies, and it needs to understand the world isn't a competition anymore. This is, the 21st century, and we need to start to understand that this is not how the world's going to operate in the future. Whether the US agrees or disagrees is not the point. This is over. But until that change happens, then nothing will change from a US perspective. And because again, it's all about the perception of strength. It's all about the perception of exceptionalism, and not really understanding that you can't function in a world anymore in that context. So Biden can go wherever he wants in the world. But is the Saudis ever going to trust him? I mean, why would you trust the United States? Because they'll say one thing, and then and of course the US only wants what benefits the US. How does this benefit Saudi? And if you don't agree, well, we're back to we'll get rid of MBS. I mean, we've seen it in Pakistan with Imran Khan, where he was basically told, if you don't, toe the line and do the things we want, then you're not going to be president anymore. And then did you see Bolton came out and basically admitted to working with coup d'etat?
I did see that.
Yeah, it was that on, I think it was CNN he was on. I mean, so this is an admission of things that people have said aren't reality. Again, engage brains, and it's a reality. But the mere fact he's come out and said this is quite astonishing, because does he not understand that this may have consequences? Because, okay, he didn't specify what coup d'etat it was, where it was, what it involved. But what happens if some of the coup d'etat he's involved in led to war crimes? Is he culpable? I don't know. I don't know what the law stands. I don't know. No international law. I don't know. But to come out and say this is frankly a very strange thing.
Yeah, it's reckless. I'm not sure.
I mean, it's bizarre. I mean,
indeed.
Or is it because maybe there's a kind of feeling now in the United States, well, the world is changing, and I need to make sure I'm on the right side of history, so I can go, well, yeah, I was involved in this, but but I mean, I'm not responsible for the consequence. And there's an argument that says, well, no, you're not directly responsible for the consequences. But if you're part of an architect of something, what does that mean in international law terms? I don't know. But there's been some very strange things coming out and admissions of things happening where there seems to be a mindset change in some aspects to this, of kind of admitting, well, we've been part of things or responsible for things. And you kind of wonder if that's partly a mindset change because of a realization of what is actually happening. Because I don't doubt that you might not in the delusionary sort of Congress in the US. But I think there's enough people on the periphery. There's enough people in the US military and intelligence. So, and people in from a financial economic standpoint, we know full well what's coming and the reality. And they're going to have to start repositioning themselves and realizing that they're going to have to walk away from things, because the risk of not walking away from this could have personally quite severe consequences, depending on, well, a whole bunch of factors, including people's involvement, work, responsibility is a bit of a grey area, and you can never be absolutely clear in some situations what's people's culpability and responsibility. But, it's like the whole biolab story with regards to the Ukraine. Now, at this point in time, it's not clear. The Russians have submitted evidence to the UN. Okay, not a lot's going to happen, but eventually you can see that there will be accountability. And what does that accountability mean? And, and we don't know what the outcome will be, but if the outcome is what the Russians claim it is, and that's an if at this point in time, the consequences for the United States will be absolutely catastrophic, because even their allies, if the US was proved to be involved in what Russia's claimed in Ukraine, it would be the end of the US, simply on the basis that its allies would go, sorry, we're going to have to cut you adrift. We can't be seen to be associating with you on the basis of this evidence, assuming that is the case. So I think there's a lot of things where, the old saying of chickens coming home to roost, I think there's a lot of things the US has been involved, not exclusively, of course. And I think there's a feeling in certain quarters, hang on, our day of reckoning's coming. There's going to be an awful lot of people extremely nervous, and we're not going to get into who's been profiting in the United States in what's gone on in Ukraine since 2014. Okay, there's the usual names bandied around. I don't frankly care who it is, because I'm not interested in personalities, but in a broader sense, there might be an enormous can of worms that's going to be unleashed in terms of what's gone on in Ukraine as well. So, eventually when empires collapse and their invincibility or perceived invincibility is on the wane, then all of a sudden accountability for what that empire has done might start to then fall for firmly and squarely on the shoulders of specific people, and that therefore might start to change attitudes in a very broad sense. Okay, maybe whatever's gone on in Ukraine, maybe ultimately this is the bargaining chip where Russia says to the Americans, right, here's the deal, this war's got to end, and you're going to agree to this war ending, and you're going to walk away from this, and you're going to do all these things, or we're just going to make sure that you become a pariah nation who will be isolated by even your allies because of your behavior and actions inside Ukraine. And the US will have no choice. It will have to just go, okay, we're going to have to walk away from this, because the consequences will be far worse by us carrying this on. And we kind of looks like we are at this point. It's very noticeable the US might want to keep providing weapons. It doesn't want to ever put any perception that it's fighting in Ukraine directly against Russia, even though there's some circumstantial evidence that there's not just US mercenaries there, but there might be US military personnel, although that has yet to be established to be the case. But they're very careful. They're very, very mindful of the fact that they don't want that to happen. And the reason they're mindful of the fact is because they know they could never face off against Russia in a war. They certainly couldn't win a ground war with Russia. They don't have the military capability. And in terms of high-tech weapons, we've said this many times, the US is light years behind Russia. And there's no Western nation that could fight Russia in a nuclear war. And there's a perfectly legitimate argument that there's no mutually assured destruction. The West will cease to exist, and Russia, okay, there's consequences of the West ceasing to exist and what that means, but from a military perspective, Russia would hardly have scratched their knee. And people go, no, that's not true. It is true. This is reality, and this is why Western people need to stop believing the lies and the propaganda, and realize that Russia is an existential threat to us in a nuclear war, and we aren't to them, and we shouldn't be pushing the rhetoric or pushing Ukraine to the extent that that could become a possibility. It's not a possibility. I don't think it will ever happen. But you know, if this was any other point in history, World War III would have happened by now. It's a different. We are effectively in a world war, economically, financially. But that's because it's all about the dollar, and the dollar has to be defended at all costs. And we've already had wars and regime change, etc., to defend it. But this is really the defense of the dollar, because the dollar underpins US hegemony, US exceptionalism, etc. So therefore, it's become a war against the dollar. It's a war of collapsing of the ultimate weapon of mass destruction that's held the rest of the world in servitude since World War II, and that's coming to an end. And so therefore, it is a kind of world war, and it's a world war between ending unipolarity and the world embracing multipolarity and understanding that that's the future, and you know, nothing will prevent this happening. Even though the West likes to think to the contrary, but it's just said it for years, it's going to happen, whether they like it or believe it or not, because the United States as an empire has been in decline for 100 years now. The Great Depression was the end of the US. It just takes a long time for events to unfold, and the US actually, ironically, thought it was in a position of strength at the end of World War II, but it wasn't. It was already in decline. And look at what's happened since World War II. I mean, look at the closing of the gold window. That's another admission. The US was in terminal decline. The financialization of the economy, in another example of terminal decline. .com collapse, terminal decline. 2008, terminal decline. And here we are in 2022. They're just trying to keep the illusion going, but you know, the empire destroyed itself. The US, the mistake it made was, when you go back to the 1880s, 1890s, and the turn of the 1900s, the US was doing all the right things. It made fundamental mistakes prior to World War One. The Federal Reserve and taxing people and all this, and turning away from the thing that made America this great thriving nation. It made all those mistakes, and by 1929 or the late 1920s, the Great Depression, caused by failure of policy, and then it's carried on, and here we are 100 years later. So when people keep going, oh, the dollar will be here for another 30 years, and they're not paying attention to what's gone on for the last 100 years, and the answer is no. And the US is far more in terminal decline than people realize, because they don't understand that the problem didn't start in 2008. 2008 was the moment when actually it was all over in totality. But what they did is they kept going by going, no, we can defy the laws of reality. Well, here we are in 2022, and the laws of reality are far worse than they were in 2008. And in fact, the consequences and the fallout in real terms is going to be far worse than if they'd admitted in 2008, okay, it's over. We're not resuscitating banks. We can't continue doing what we're doing. We have to change. And we have to work in cooperation. And if not that they were ever going to do it, but if they'd done that, we could have now been really in 2022 with major change in global perspective, a multipolar world that would have been hugely beneficial. The US would have been beginning to really make significant strides in becoming a great nation amongst equals, which benefits them and the world. But instead, we are where we are, and the consequences of that behavior will mean the rebuilding process is going to take a lot longer. And also, you know, the issue of trust in the US is going to take that much longer. Because even in 2008, despite things that have gone on, that the world trusted the United States to a far greater extent than it does now. 2008 was, hang on, we can't trust you anymore. The Chinese went, we've always given you endless for cheap $3. You've given us treasuries. That's the agreement. You've reneged on that agreement. That was a devastating policy misjudgment. And, here we are, as we say today, and the longer this carries on, the longer it will take the US to recover and be a great nation amongst equals, because it's going to need the cooperation of the global South for it to achieve its objectives. And until it understands that, then the problems will just get worse and worse. And everyone always goes, when will things collapse? Well, there's no timestamp on this. But, when we get the next big problem is September, October. That's going to be another very telling moment. And that might be the moment that tips everything over the edge in totality. It might not be, because we don't know. But we're already starting to see immense challenges in the financial system that are only going to get worse and worse as we get to that point. So we need to be mindful. Why not have this idea that everything's years in the future, and because that's not even a reality anymore. And I think the acceleration of change has surprised even the Chinese and the Russians. Even though they knew it was coming, I think the last year or two has surprised them. But I don't think they understood just how weak the West was and how weak the United States was. Forget it's something to do with military. That's one totally separate, but economically and financially. They didn't understand the weakness. And I think the pandemic sort of made them go, well, they are extremely weak, because the pandemic started within 2 weeks. It was like, give everyone trillions of dollars, otherwise the country collapses. Then I think there was an understanding. There's nothing of substance. It's not even a question of building a house on proper foundations. Yeah, there's no foundations, but even the building was an illusion. It didn't really exist. There was nothing there. And that proved it. And obviously, subsequently, the last couple of years have really cemented in the minds of those two nations that actually the US is far more vulnerable than we thought they were. And obviously, the contagion risk, even for us as two nations, is quite severe. So we need to start making steps to avoid, as much as possible, our exposure. That Russia is partly happened because of actions they've taken prior to the war starting. But I mean, the West has actually done them a favor by cutting them off. I mean, it's ideal for them, because it removes the backlash and the risk of their exposure. Here's the question: what's the contagion risk of the West collapsing for Russia? Now, you can argue, well, they're not going to sell energy, but the West is weaning itself off Russian energy, and Russia's selling energy to somewhere else anyway. So how much they're actually done Russia a favor by removing a lot of the contagion problems. And it's the same for China to make those decisions, and they are doing that. But obviously, it's a more complicated situation for them. This is why probably ultimately the nation that will handle what's coming better than anyone, and we've said this for a long time, is Russia itself. I think they've always been the Renaissance nation. They're the nation, the glue in the multipolar world. They're the glue in Eurasia, and they're the nation that will fundamentally change and drive multipolarity more than anything China could ever do.
Yep. I agree, Paul. Paul, great assessment, great update. Also, I think we need to establish credit where credit is due in terms of a couple of the comments earlier in the chat stream, or just in regards to just how accurate and spot on you have been the past several years. So congratulations on that, Paul.
You know what? I wish I was wrong.
I know, that's why I say congratulations for for not sure the reason why.
What?
But yes, you're
yeah, but you know what? There was, for me, it's always been a question. This is, there's a logical path through everything. There was always things happening. The things were always going to come to fruition. And sometimes people go, well, you're pro this, you're pro that. No, I'm just telling you, this is what will happen. I'm not pro anything. I'm not pro any political system or anything. I just think This is the 21st century. It's about time we were grown up. We were adults. We behaved responsibly. We make the right decisions. And at the moment, China and Russia are making far more responsible decisions than the West is. But it's not a question of believing in Chinese politics or believing in anything or being capitalist or communist or anything else. It's just not, for me, the way it is. I think there's a very simple, logical way to do things. And unfortunately, we end up savaging the West all the time, but legitimately so. And I will look forward to the day then we can talk about the United States and all the great developments and how, look, the US is rebuilding itself. It's rebuilding trust. It's becoming a great nation amongst equals, because when the US does that, not only will it be immensely beneficial to America itself, but the world will benefit hugely, and the world wants that. Russia doesn't want to be and have this relationship with the United States the way it is, because they know it's self-destructive. For the US, it's also just not productive for them. And when that happens, it'd be great to report all the big developments. And I don't doubt at some point that will happen, and hopefully it happens sooner rather than later. But unfortunately, as empires collapse, there isn't a lot of positive things we can say about the US or the UK or Europe, because they're not doing anything positive. Everything they're doing is damaging. It's destructive. It's not conducive to the future. But that's what happens. Empires, the Soviet Union's a great example. They didn't see any of it. And I'm not trying to make comparisons, but a useful analogy is World War II. The Nazis lost World War II when they lost Stalingrad. The war was over. That was the turning point. But look how long it took. And even in March 1945, they were going, we're going to win the war. And then it took, the Russians to be at the gates of Berlin, and they went, oh, we've lost the war. It's over now. But it was long since over. And that's the thing. Empires or prospective empires don't see the writing on the wall until it's so obvious. I use that horrible analogy of a ton of manure on the doorstep. And unfortunately, we're going to take a ton of manure on the doorstep for the West to understand that that's where we are. And sadly, that is the way it is. I wish it wasn't. And I wish we didn't have to talk this way. But it always is, because people are indoctrinated, they're tribal, they hang on to things. And my attitude is, don't hang on to something that's just damaging or destructive, because what purpose does it serve? So for me to have to keep saying the things we do, and for years going, well, China and Russia's doing this. These are positive developments. This is part of the multipolar world, and it's changing. That's just how it was. It was very obvious. It's easy to chart. It's easy to say this is the future. But I can't think of anything Western nations have done in the last decade or since 2000, or that you would actually turn around and go, that was a really positive statement of intent, a positive decision, something that's beneficial for the nation itself and the nation's people and the wider world. We don't see it. And this is why people invest all this energy in domestic politics. But don't ask the simple question, well, when did anything these people do ever materially improve the lives of the people of our nation? Never. Never in my lifetime. Everything gets worse and worse and worse. Oh, we'll get rid of them and get the others back in. Hang on. Do you not remember the others did nothing either? And people don't see this. And again, it's because of this belief that I get to vote every 4 or 5 years. It's democracy. It's not democracy. It's the illusion. It's the illusion of democracy. It's the illusion of economics, of financial system, of education, of the military, of the media. Everything's an illusion. And people, not so much as they were, but they're still buying into the illusion. And as they continue to do that, they don't see reality. But reality is now becoming something that everyone has to face, because you can't print oil and gas. You can't print food. You can't print the very things that the fabric of a society depends on. And they've never had to face this before, but now they're facing it, and they don't even realize the complexity and enormity of that problem. But it's coming, and it's coming very rapidly. And it's a logical conclusion. The energy problem is going to get worse because around the corner, autumn and winter's coming. You get to September, October, November, December, we're going to be in a very different place. And then what's the issue of food security? We've gone through growing seasons in the Northern Hemisphere. What shortfall have we got in agricultural produce? What problems? And this is why this autumn, and I use the September, October, and going through that, there's the financial cycle, but there's also the ramifications of food and energy insecurity. And this winter is going to be very challenging. And I think there was a really interesting statement. I don't know, may have been the deputy prime minister in Romania, of all countries, who came out, I think, yesterday and made a very telling statement when they said the EU will pay a heavy price for anti-Russian sanctions. And it will be a harsh winter, maybe the harshest winter in the last 40, 50, 60 years for the whole of Europe. The end of the conflict between the West and Russia is still not in sight. That tells you everything you need to know. That's that, there are some cool heads going, this is a massive problem. Watch what happens this winter, and are we going to survive the consequences of what's going to happen? We don't know. We should never be in this position, but we are. And because politics is what it is, we don't go, this is madness. Russia switch all the energy back on. Let's negotiate the end of the war. And let's actually try and resolve the problem. No, we can't do that. Yeah. Okay, well, the West will collapse, and we'll see what happens this winter, and then we'll have to deal with the consequences. Madness, but reality. Well, madness and the illusion of reality.
Absolutely, Paul. Paul, I want to thank you for a great discussion today. Also, a friendly reminder that the replay of today's live stream will be exclusively available over at the gadfly.vhx.tv. So venture over there, start your 30 days free subscription today, and then you can figure out whether you want to go the month-to-month or the annual as well. So thank you, Paul. And Paul, we will be back soon, and want to thank you for your time today and a great review. Great discussion.
Yeah, I just wish it wasn't reality, but we knew it was coming. This was always going to be the case, but we just have to keep telling people the reality and hoping more and more people understand the reality, and not that we can affect change on an individual basis, but at least we can affect change in how we deal with things from our own perspective and our family, friends, etc. And that's all you can do.
Yep, absolutely. All right. Thank you, everyone, for tuning into the live stream. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we will be back real soon. Take care.